Louise Cooper had ridden 11 miles through a dust storm on a borrowed horse to get an answer from a man who had stopped giving them, and she was not leaving until she had won. The year was 1878, and the town of Redemption Creek, Texas sat baked and cracked under an unforgiving August sun. It was the kind of summer that turned rivers to mud and turned tempers to powder kegs, and Louise had been sitting on a spark for 3 weeks now, ever since Jonas Granger had walked away from the deal that was supposed to save her family's ranch without so much as a written explanation or the decency to look her in the eye when he did it. She had heard plenty of things about Jonas Granger. Most folks in Redemption Creek had. They said he was fair but hard, that he ran the Granger land with a precision that bordered on coldness, that he had come back from the war in '65 with fewer words than he had left with, and had not bothered to collect any new ones since. They said he had mourned his wife, Clara, for 4 years, and had since devoted himself entirely to the land, to his cattle, to the kind of solitary work that kept a man from thinking too hard about anything that wasn't in front of him. Louise Cooper had not cared about any of that before today. She had cared about the agreement. She had cared about the water rights her father had negotiated with Jonas before her father died. The handshake deal that Jonas had apparently decided meant nothing now that Wallace Dunmore had come sniffing around the creek with money in his fist and lawyers in his pocket. Wallace Dunmore, who wanted every acre between the ridge and the canyon. Wallace Dunmore, who had made 3 separate offers on Louise's land in the past 6 months and had been refused all 3 times. And now, without explanation, Jonas Granger had pulled back from the water-sharing arrangement that was the only thing keeping her cattle from dying and her livelihood from collapsing. She rode through the gate of the Granger property with her jaw set and her spine straight, her dark hair pinned back under her hat, the hem of her riding skirt caked with red dust. She was 26 years old and she had been running the Cooper Ranch alone for 8 months, and she was not in the habit of letting men make decisions that affected her life without at least making them look her in the face when they did it. The Granger Ranch was something to behold, even when a person was furious. The main house was a solid 2-story structure of rough-hewn timber and pale stone, with a wide porch that faced west toward the hills. The yard was orderly, the fencing recently repaired, the barn freshly whitewashed. A large water trough stood near the house, full and still in the afternoon heat. Louise noted the water with a tightness in her chest. He had plenty of it. He always had. A ranch hand she did not recognize stepped out from the direction of the barn and squinted at her. "I am looking for Jonas Granger," she said, pulling her horse to a stop. The ranch hand, a young man with a sunburned nose and wide eyes, looked her up and down the way men sometimes did when they were trying to figure out whether a woman was trouble. "He is out back, working the fence line near the south pasture." "Ma'am, he does not usually take visitors when he is working. He does not usually cancel agreements without explanation either," Louise said pleasantly, and dismounted. She tied her horse to the post near the trough and walked around the side of the house without waiting for the ranch hand to decide what to do about her. She found Jonas Granger where the hand had said she would. He was crouched beside a section of split-rail fencing, using a mallet to drive a new post into the hard earth. He had removed his hat and set it on the grass beside him, and his dark hair was damp with sweat. He was broader through the shoulders than she remembered from their brief meetings at her father's table 2 years ago, and there were more lines around his eyes, but she recognized him immediately. He was 33 years old, and he looked like a man who had spent a great deal of that time outdoors doing difficult things. He heard her boots in the dry grass and looked up. She stopped a few feet away and looked him directly in the eye. "I want to know why," she said. "And I want the actual reason, not whatever you told my father's foreman when he rode over to ask." Jonas Granger set down the mallet slowly. He straightened to his full height, which was considerable, and studied her for a moment with an expression that was hard to read. His eyes were a dark, serious gray, the kind of gray that could go either way in a storm. "Miss Cooper," he said, His voice was lower than she remembered, quieter. "It is Louise," she said. "We have been neighbors for 2 years and you ate at our table 4 times. You can call me Louise." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite guilt. Something more complicated than that. "Louise," he said, "you rode all this way alone." "Do not do that," she said sharply. "Do not make this about me riding alone. Answer the question." He looked at her for another long moment, and she had the distinct sense that he was deciding something. Not whether to answer, she realized. He had already decided that. He was deciding how much of the truth to tell. "Come up to the porch," he said at last. "It is too hot to stand in this sun and have this conversation properly." "I am fine in the sun." "I am not asking for your comfort," he said, with a patience that was not condescending. "I am asking for mine. Come up to the porch." She blinked. Then, because it was a reasonable request and because she was not actually unreasonable even when she was furious, she followed him. The porch was shaded and about 10 degrees cooler than the south pasture. There were 2 wooden chairs and a small table. Jonas gestured to a chair and she sat, and he sat across from her and leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and looked at the boards of the porch for a moment before he looked up at her. "Dunmore came to see me," he said, 3 weeks ago." Louise's chest tightened, but she said nothing. "He made me an offer for the water rights along the shared creek line. More money than I needed and less than he could afford to spend. I told him no." Jonas paused. "Then he told me that if I continued the arrangement with your ranch, he would move against the Eastern Access Road." The Eastern Access Road was the only way Jonas could get his cattle to the stockyards in the fall without an additional 4 days of driving. Louise knew that. Her father had known that. It had been one of the quiet strategic facts of the whole arrangement from the beginning. "He threatened you," she said. "He informed me of his intentions," Jonas said carefully, "which amounts to the same thing. And so you pulled back from the agreement without telling me why." "I sent a letter." "You sent 3 lines," Louise said, and her voice had an edge to it that she did not bother to soften. 3 lines that said you were reviewing the arrangement and would be in touch. You were not in touch. Weeks passed. "My cattle are down to the last of the water in the eastern pond, Jonas. Another 3 weeks without access to the creek and I lose a quarter of my herd at minimum." He winced. It was a small movement, but she caught it. "I know," he said. "I was trying to work out a way to manage Dunmore before I came to you, without telling me that Dunmore was involved." She let that sit between them for a moment. "You were going to fix it before I found out there was something to fix." "Yes," he said simply. She exhaled slowly. The anger she had carried 11 miles was still there, but it was shifting in shape, becoming something more nuanced and harder to ride. She had expected to come here and find arrogance or cowardice or some small-minded reason she could be righteously furious about. She had not expected to find a man who had, in his own infuriatingly self-sufficient way, been trying to protect her. "That was not your decision to make," she said, and her voice was quieter now but no less certain. "My father is gone. This ranch is mine. Whatever trouble is coming at it, I have a right to know about it." Jonas looked at her steadily. "You are right," he said. "I should have come to you the same day Dunmore left my property." The plainness of it caught her off guard. She had expected more evasion. "You should have," she agreed. "I am sorry, Louise." The way he said her name that second time was different from the first. She could not have explained how. It just was. They sat in silence for a moment, and Louise became aware, now that the immediate fury had found its outlet, that she was extremely tired. She had been awake since 4 that morning. She had ridden 11 miles in the heat. Her back ached and her throat was dry, and the anger had been the thing keeping her upright for the last several hours. And now that it had settled into something more complicated, she felt the exhaustion underneath it like the hard ground under a thin layer of snow. "What are you going to do about Dunmore?" she asked. "I'm going to restore the water arrangement with your ranch," Jonas said. "Starting tomorrow morning. Your foreman can bring the cattle to the creek from first light. And the eastern road. Dunmore does not own the land the road crosses. He owns the land adjacent to it. He has been telling people he can block access, but I had my man look into the deeds last week and he cannot. The road was registered as common access in the original land survey of 1861. He has no legal ground. Louise stared at him. You already know that. I found out 4 days ago. I was going to ride over to your ranch tomorrow. 4 days, she said, and there was something between exasperation and laughter in her voice. You knew 4 days ago and you were going to ride over tomorrow. I had a fence to mend, he said, and then something happened that she had not expected from the famously quiet and serious Jonas Granger. He almost smiled. It was not a full smile. It was just a slight curve at one corner of his mouth, barely there, like sunlight finding a crack in a shutter. But it was something. Louise looked at that almost smile and felt something entirely inconvenient happen in her chest. She looked away quickly. Right, she said. Well, I saved you the ride. You did, he said. Another silence. This one was different from the first. Quieter in a different way, less charged with anger and more charged with something she was not prepared to name at 6 in the afternoon after an 11-mile ride on a borrowed horse. Jonas looked at her then, really looked at her, the way she had not been looked at since before her father got sick, which was the way a person looks at another person when they are genuinely trying to understand what they see. Louise, he said. Are you hungry? She blinked. Of all the things she had expected from this conversation, that had not been one of them. I beg your pardon. You rode 11 miles in August heat, he said. You have been up since early, I would guess, based on the miles. It is past 6 in the evening and the ride back is another hour and a half at least. I was going to make supper. There is enough for 2. She looked at him. He was watching her with that gray, steady gaze, patient and entirely serious, and she understood suddenly that this was not a dismissal or an attempt to change the subject. He was simply asking if she was hungry. Yes, she said, because she was, and because she was also not ready to get back on a horse and ride away from this porch and this strange, shifting conversation and the almost smile she had not expected. I suppose I am. He nodded and stood. Then come inside. The kitchen of the Granger house was large and clean and smelled of wood smoke and coffee. There was a cast iron stove that had clearly seen many years of hard use, and a long table of heavy oak, and a window that faced the yard where the evening light was turning everything to copper and amber. Jonas moved around the kitchen with a quiet competence that Louise found unexpected and oddly compelling. He pulled out a skillet, unwrapped a cut of salted pork from the cold box, sliced potatoes from a cloth bag hanging near the door. You cook for yourself, she said, not quite a question. I have 2 ranch hands, but they bunk in the barn and they are not much for cooking, he said, setting the skillet on the stove. Clara used to cook. After she passed, I learned. It was said plainly, without self-pity, and Louise respected him for that. How long has it been? She asked. 4 years in November, he said. Fever, she was gone in a week. He paused. It was very fast. I am sorry. My father went the same year, he said. And then my brother Thomas went to Montana and did not come back. So it has been a quiet few years. Louise looked at the wide, empty kitchen and understood it differently. She thought of her own house, equally quiet since her father's death, the sound of boots that were not there, the chair at the table that she had moved to face the wall because she could not stand looking at it empty. My father died in December, she said, 8 months ago. I know, Jonas said quietly. I heard. I should have come by. Yes, she said, you should have. He looked at her over his shoulder, acknowledging it without excuse, and went back to the stove. She sat at the table and watched him cook, and they talked, which was the thing that surprised her most. She had expected to get her answer and leave, or to get her answer and argue more. She had not expected this. The easy, unexpected flow of a real conversation, the way he listened when she spoke, fully and without the restless half-attention that most men gave a woman's words when they had already decided what they thought. He asked her about the ranch. Not in the polite, surface way men sometimes asked, but in specific, practical ways that told her he already understood what it meant to run a cattle operation alone. She told him about the herd numbers. The way she had restructured the summer grazing rotation to get more out of the north pasture. The the trouble she had been having with a gap in the east fence that the cattle kept finding. He listened and then said, "Have you tried a double post system at the corner? The cattle push the angle post loose over time. If you anchor two posts 18 inches apart and cross-brace them, they cannot lever it out the same way." She had not tried that. She made a mental note. Supper was ready, and he set a plate in front of her that was better than she had expected, the pork well seasoned with salt and dried herbs, the potatoes crispy at the edges, a heel of bread from a loaf on the counter. She was hungrier than she had realized, and she ate without pretending otherwise. He seemed to appreciate that. He ate across from her at the big oak table, and the window threw long evening light across the wood between them. They talked through supper. She asked him about the Dunmore situation in more detail, and he laid out what he knew about Wallace Dunmore's plans with the patience and clarity of a man who had been thinking it through carefully. Dunmore had money from back east, from his father's railroad investments, and he wanted to consolidate land in the Creek Valley into one large operation. He had already bought out the Haskell family and the two small homestead plots west of town. The Cooper Ranch and the Granger land were the remaining pieces he needed to complete the picture. "He will not stop coming," Jonas said. "I know," Louise said. "He will not get my land. My father built that place. My mother helped him build it before she died. I was born in that house." Something in Jonas's expression shifted when she said that, a kind of understanding that went deeper than sympathy. "I was born in this house," he said. They looked at each other, and something passed between them that neither of them acknowledged out loud, but both of them felt. After the plates were cleared, Louise stood and went to the window and looked at the yard, which was blue and gray in the falling dusk, the hills in the distance turning to dark shapes against the last light. She had planned to leave after supper. She had told herself that was what she would do: eat, thank him, get back on the horse, ride home. But Jonas had gone to the small shelf near the stove where he kept a coffee pot, and he was making coffee with the ease of a man who assumed she would stay a while longer, and she found that she did not want to correct his assumption. "He has a lawyer in Abilene," she said, still looking at the window. "Dunmore does. I found that out last month. He has been having deeds reviewed. I do not know what he is looking for. Probably weaknesses," Jonas said. "Old survey disputes. Water claims that were never properly registered." He paused. "Is your deed solid?" "I believe so," she said. "My father was careful, but I have not had a lawyer look at it since he died." She turned from the window. "I cannot afford a lawyer in Abilene." "I can lend you one," Jonas said. He poured 2 cups of coffee and set them on the table. "A man in Abilene named Reed who has done work for my family for 20 years. He would do it as a favor to me." She looked at him. "That is a significant offer." "It is a practical one," he said. "If Dunmore takes your land, he is directly adjacent to my south fence. The next offer he makes me becomes considerably more difficult to refuse. Helping you keep your ranch helps me keep mine." It was the practical framing that made her trust it more than if he had said it was simple generosity. She sat back down. "All right," she said. "I would be grateful." He sat across from her and wrapped both hands around his coffee cup, and the light from the lamp on the table caught the lines of his face, the set of his jaw, the way he was looking at her with that gray, steady gaze that she was becoming, against her better judgment, rather attached to. "You are not what I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" "I do not know precisely," he said slowly. "Your father spoke of you. He said you were the most capable person he knew. I thought it was a father speaking. And now—" "I think he was right," Jonas said simply. Louise looked at her coffee cup. There was a warmth moving up through her chest that had nothing to do with the coffee. "He spoke well of you too," she said. "He said you were an honest man, which in his accounting was the highest thing he could say about a person." "He was a good man," Jonas said quietly. "I should have come by in December. I mean that." "You were managing your own grief," she said, and was a little surprised by her own generosity in saying it, but it felt true. "That is not a good enough reason," he said. "You were alone." She looked up at him. "I managed." "I know you did," he said, and there was something in his voice, a kind of warmth carefully contained, like a fire in a stone hearth. That does not mean you should have had two. The lamp between them burned steadily. Outside, the darkness was complete now, the stars beginning to show over the hills. A night wind had come up, the kind that arrived in August only after the sun had been down a while, and it moved through the window screen with a smell of dry grass and distant rain that probably would not come. Louise became aware that it was fully dark outside, and that she should have left an hour ago. She was not afraid of the ride exactly, but the road between the Granger property and her ranch was 12 miles at night, and her borrowed horse was not young, and the honest assessment was that she had waited too long to make it sensible. "I am going to need to stay," she said, and the way she said it was completely matter of fact because she was a practical woman. "If that is not too much of an imposition." Jonas looked at her across the lamp and did not appear surprised. "No imposition," he said. "There is a spare room. Clara's sister used it when she visited. I will put clean sheets on." He said it with the same plainness that characterized everything he said, and she was grateful for it. There was no suggestion in it, no awkwardness, just a man solving a practical problem. She helped him make up the bed, which was a narrow, decent room with a window that faced north, and they moved around each other in the small space with a natural ease that was slightly astonishing, given that they had spent most of their acquaintance as peripheral figures in each other's lives. He handed her the pillow, she pulled the case over it, and when they both reached for the corner of the quilt at the same time and their hands brushed in the lamplight, both of them went very still for a second. Then he stepped back and she smoothed the quilt and neither of them said anything about it. He left her the lamp and she sat on the edge of the spare bed in the quiet house and listened to him move around downstairs, the sound of his boots on the floorboards, water being poured, the small sounds of a person settling the house for the night. She sat there for a long time, thinking about Dunmore and water rights and the Eastern Road and the way Jonas Granger's voice sounded when he said her name, and she could not have told you which of those things occupied the most space in her mind, but she had a suspicion. She did not sleep right away. Instead, she got up and went quietly downstairs because she had seen a lamp still burning in the front room when she passed the door, and she was right. Jonas was sitting in the armchair near the window with a book open on his knee and a glass of whiskey on the table beside him, and he looked up when she appeared in the doorway without apparent surprise. "I cannot sleep," she said. "Neither can I," he said. "Usually." She came in and sat on the straight-back chair near the cold fireplace. He closed the book without marking his page, which meant he had not really been reading. "What were you actually thinking about?" she asked. "You," he said, and then seemed to weigh whether he had said too much, and then seemed to decide he had not. Specifically, how to approach the Dunmore matter in a way that protects both properties. She accepted that. "And what did you conclude?" "That a united front is harder to pressure than two separate ones," he said. "That if we make clear to Dunmore that neither property will sell and that we intend to pursue any legal action he takes all the way to the district court, he may decide the effort is not worth the expense. He has more money than us." "Probably," Jonas said, "but he is also impatient. His type usually is. They expect money to open doors quickly and they get tired when the doors do not open. If we make it a long enough fight, he may look for easier ground elsewhere. And if he does not, then we make it the longest fight he has ever had," Jonas said, and there was something quietly fierce in it that made Louise feel, for the first time in 8 months, that she was not fighting alone. She looked at the dark fireplace. "My father always said the land is not worth anything if you do not have anyone to share it with." Jonas was quiet for a moment. "He was a wise man," he said. "He was," she agreed. "He also said that the most important thing about a person is what they do when the doing is difficult." "And what did you decide?" Jonas asked. She looked at him. "About you," he met her gaze steadily. "About me. I decided," she said slowly, "that the reason you did not come to me when Dunmore threatened you was not cowardice or selfishness. It was because you were trying to fix it before anyone else had to carry it. Which is a particular kind of stubborn goodness that I recognize because I do exactly the same thing." Jonas looked at her for a long moment with those steady gray eyes. That may be the most accurate description of me I have ever heard from someone who has known me less than a day. We have known each other 2 years, she said. We have been neighbors 2 years, he said. We have known each other since about 4 o'clock this afternoon. She smiled at that, and it was the first real smile she had given since she had arrived, and she felt it do something to her face that smiling used to do when smiling came more easily. Jonas Granger watched it happen, and something in his expression shifted in a way that he did not try to hide. They talked through the night. That was the honest truth of it. They talked about their fathers and about the land, and about what it meant to stay in a place when staying was hard, and about Clara, whom Jonas described with a quiet love and grief that did not try to be anything other than what it was, and about Louise's mother, who had died when Louise was 12, and whom Louise described with the kind of careful, detailed memory a person builds when they are afraid of forgetting. They talked about the cattle business, and about the town of Redemption Creek, and about the war, which Jonas had served in for 3 years and come back from changed in ways he was willing to name with a steadiness that impressed her. They talked about books, because he had shelves of them and she had her father's collection, and it turned out they had both read the same battered copy of a Dickens novel that was usually available through the post, and they disagreed about one of the characters in a way that generated 20 minutes of surprisingly heated and entirely enjoyable argument. At some point Jonas got up and made more coffee because the hour was past midnight, and when he came back he sat not in the armchair but on the settee closer to where she was sitting, and neither of them commented on this, but she was aware of it in the way she was aware of the weather, as a simple fact with a weight to it. She told him about the summer she was 19 and her father had been badly ill with typhoid, and she had run the ranch by herself for 2 months, making decisions she did not know how to make, losing sleep she could not afford to lose, writing letters to her father's bank in a voice she did not quite have yet. "I was so afraid," she said, "every single day, but I never told anyone because there was no one to tell and it would not have changed anything." "That is a kind of courage people do not always see," Jonas said quietly. "It did not feel like courage," she said. "It felt like necessity." "Those are the same thing mostly," he said. She looked at him in the lamplight, and he was close enough now that she could see the particular shade of gray in his eyes, and the way the weariness and the watchfulness coexisted in his face, and she thought that this man had been carrying a great deal of weight in a great deal of silence, and that she recognized that in a way that felt like the recognition of something familiar. "Do you get lonely?" she asked. He considered the question with the seriousness he gave all things. "Yes," he said. "More than I usually let myself acknowledge." "So do I," she said. The lamp between them burned and the night outside was deep and still, the stars enormous over the Texas plain, and the house was quiet except for the sound of their voices, which had become in the space of a few hours something that both of them had forgotten the feel of, genuinely wanted company. Around 2 in the morning she said, "Jonas, I want to ask you something and I want you to answer honestly." "All right," he said. "When Dunmore came to you with that threat," she said, "was any part of your hesitation about the fact that I am a woman running the ranch alone? Did any part of you think that the problem would be simpler if someone else were in charge of the Cooper land?" He looked at her without flinching. "No," he said. "I have been aware since your father got sick that you were running that operation, and everything I heard about it from people in town, from my ranch hands who talked to yours at the feed store, from my own observation of how the Cooper land has looked this past year, told me that you were running it well, better than some men I could name. Then why did you not come to me?" "Because," he said, and then he stopped and started again. "Because I am not good at asking for help or at sharing trouble. I handle things alone, and I do not always remember in time that other people might want to be part of handling them." He paused. "That is a failing in me, Louise, not a judgment on you," she nodded slowly. "I know that feeling," she said, "deeply and personally." "I know," he said. "I have been watching you describe it all evening without using those words." She tilted her head. "You have been listening carefully." "I have," he said simply. The fire was not lit, but the night was warm, and the lamp threw a gold circle of light that enclosed the settee and the chair, and the two people sitting in them. And Louise thought that she had come here 11 miles in a dust storm to get an answer, and had gotten it, and had not left, and now it was 2 in the morning. And she was sitting in a pool of lamplight talking to Jonas Granger about loneliness and courage and books, and she could not think of a single place she would rather be. That was a significant thought, and she let herself have it without immediately arguing with it. When the clock on the mantel struck 3, she said, "I should sleep." "Yes," he agreed. Neither of them moved for another moment. Then he said, "Louise." "Yes." He looked at her with the careful, considered attention of a man who does not say things he does not mean. "I am glad you came today, for the record." She looked at him and felt that warmth again, the contained and steady warmth of a fire in a stone hearth, and she said, "For the record, so am I." She went upstairs, and this time she slept. In the morning she came down to find Jonas already at the stove, and the smell of coffee and bacon filling the kitchen, and the early light coming clean through the east window in long golden bars. He was fully dressed, his hat on the peg by the door, his shirt fresh. He looked up when she came in and said good morning and poured her coffee, and they ate breakfast together at the big oak table with the morning birds loud in the yard outside, and it felt with a comfort that was slightly astonishing, normal. "I need to get back," she said after breakfast. "My foreman will be wondering." "I will ride with you," Jonas said. "You do not have to do that." "You rode 11 miles alone yesterday," he said. "It is daylight and not a difficult road, I know that." "I would like to ride with you anyway." She looked at him across the table. "Why?" "Because," he said, with the directness that she had come to understand was simply his way, "I am not ready to stop talking to you." She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she said, "Then come." They rode the 11 miles together in the morning light, the horses easy on the road, the hills golden to the east, the sky that deep early blue that only happened in August for about an hour before the heat turned it white. They talked most of the way, resuming threads from the night's conversation as if there had been no interruption. And twice they fell into a comfortable quiet that was not uncomfortable at all, but felt like the quiet of people who have settled something between them. They reached the gates of the Cooper ranch just past 8 in the morning. Louise's foreman, a solid, weathered man named Harlan Briggs, who had worked for her father for 15 years and who Louise trusted completely, was crossing the yard from the direction of the barn. He stopped when he saw who was riding with her, and his expression went through several calculations. "Morning, Miss Cooper," he said carefully. "Mr. Granger." "Good morning, Harlan," Louise said, dismounting. "Mr. Granger is restoring the water arrangement on the creek, effective today. You can bring the herd from the south pasture to the lower creek access starting this morning." Harlan's expression did not change much, but his eyes went warm with relief. "Yes, ma'am. That is good news." "It is," she agreed. Jonas had dismounted and was standing with his horse, and he was looking at the Cooper ranch with the attentive, appreciative gaze of a man who knows land and knows what he is looking at. The house was smaller than his, older, but it had been kept up carefully, and the yard was orderly, and the fencing was sound, and the whole property had the look of something that had been worked with pride over a long time. "Your father built this himself?" he asked. "With my mother and a crew of 3, she said. "In 1851. I was born 3 years later." She paused. "He always said the first winter nearly killed them. The second winter nearly killed the cattle. By the third winter they knew what they were doing." "That is how it usually goes," Jonas said. Louise walked him around the property because he was there, and because she found herself wanting to show it to him. The east fence with the problematic corner post, the south pasture where the grass was good, the kitchen garden behind the house that she tended herself, the small smokehouse, the well that her father had sunk in 1855 and that had never run dry. Jonas asked practical questions and offered 2 or 3 suggestions that were worth thinking about. and she found that being asked about the details of her land by someone who genuinely wanted to know the answers was a pleasure she had not had in longer than she could readily measure. They ended up leaning on the fence of the north paddock watching a group of young horses that Louise was training for sale, and the sun was up properly now, warm on their backs, and Jonas said, "I would like to come back." "To see the horses?" she asked. "To see you," he said, with the same directness that she had by now stopped being surprised by. He was not a man who dressed things up. She looked at the horses. Her heart was doing something she thought she had probably outgrown. "When?" she said. "Sunday," he said, "if that is convenient." "Sunday is fine," she said. He came Sunday. He came the Sunday after that. He came on a Wednesday in between because there was a question about the shared water access and a fence line that needed discussing, and that was the reason he gave. But by the time he arrived at her door with his hat in his hands and that slight careful smile, both of them knew perfectly well that the fence line was a pretext, and he had simply wanted to come, and she had simply wanted him to. They walked the fence line anyway, and spent 2 hours discussing it in detail, and then sat on her porch until the sun went down talking about everything and nothing. And Harlan, who had been working for the Cooper family long enough to keep his own counsel, made sure to be busy elsewhere and did not comment. Through September the visits continued, and became something that both of them looked forward to with an honest intensity that neither of them was fully willing to name out loud. Not yet, because both of them were careful people who had been hurt in the ways that careful people still get hurt, and they were taking this one honest step at a time. Louise was aware, with a clarity that she found both exhilarating and slightly terrifying, that she was falling in love with Jonas Granger. She was aware of it the way you become aware of the approach of a storm, not all at once but gradually, the light changing, the air changing, something in the quality of everything becoming more charged and more real. She was falling in love with the way he listened, with the way he was honest without being unkind, with the way he moved through the world with a quiet purposefulness that was not coldness, but was actually a kind of deep and steady attention, with the fact that he made her feel, for the first time since her father died, that she was known. She thought about that. Being known was not the same as being seen. Plenty of people saw her. They saw a woman running a ranch alone and had opinions about that ranging from impressed to doubtful. Being known meant someone had looked at the actual contents of you and found them worth looking at, and Jonas looked at her the way he looked at his land, with close attention and genuine care and the willingness to stay. Dunmore made his next move in early October. He sent a man to Louise's ranch with a new offer, higher than the previous 3, and a letter that was politely worded and subtly threatening. The letter suggested that there were irregularities in the water rights documentation that might bear investigation. Louise read it twice and then saddled her horse and rode to the Granger property, which was becoming a familiar enough trip that her horse seemed to know the way. Jonas read the letter standing in his kitchen while she watched him from across the table. She watched his expression go through several things, none of them good. He set the letter down and was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I am going to write to Reed in Abilene today. I want him out here within the week." "All right," she said. "And I think," Jonas said, "we should both be very clear and public about the fact that neither of us intends to sell. Dunmore is banking on uncertainty. If he knows the answer is a definitive no from both of us, it removes the reason to keep pushing. How do we make it public?" He looked at her steadily. "Come to the Founders' Day gathering in town next Saturday with me," he said. "Let people see that we are standing together on this." Founders' Day in Redemption Creek was the social event of the fall season, attended by everyone in the region. It was held in the town square, with a potluck supper and dancing after dark, and it was the kind of occasion where alliances and attitudes were displayed for the community to read. Louise understood exactly what he was proposing. She also understood that showing up at Founders' Day with Jonas Granger would mean something to the town beyond the strategic statement about Dunmore. People would talk. She was not afraid of people talking, but she wanted to be clear with him about what she was agreeing to. Jonas, she said, if we go together, people will assume certain things. Yes, he said. Are you all right with that? He looked at her across the kitchen with the particular look she had come to know best, the one that was completely direct and entirely careful at the same time. Louise, he said, I would not have asked if I were not. She held his gaze for a moment. Then yes, she said, I will come. Something happened in his expression then, not the almost smile, but something warmer and more open than she had seen before. Good, he said. They went a Founders' Day together, and the effect was exactly what Jonas had predicted. People noticed. People talked. Several men who had seemed uncertain about where they stood on the Dunmore question found reasons to come over and shake Jonas's hand and express their respect for the Cooper family and their confidence in the land arrangements along the creek. Wallace Dunmore himself was not at the gathering, but his ranch foreman was, and Louise saw the man watching her and Jonas from across the square with an expression that was calculating and not happy. There was dancing after the potluck, as there always was, fiddle music and lamplight, and the smell of autumn coming in from the hills. Louise had not danced in a long time, not since before her father's illness, and she had not expected Jonas to ask her because he did not seem like a man who danced, but he held out his hand during the second reel and she took it. He was not a graceful dancer. He was competent and steady, which was entirely consistent with everything else about him, and he held her hand firmly and kept the proper distance with a care that was somehow more intimate than carelessness would have been. She could feel the warmth of his hand through her glove, and she was aware of him in the way she had been aware of the storm's approach. The air charged, everything very bright and very clear. When the music changed to something slower, he did not step back and she did not move away, and the distance between them diminished slightly in a way that was neither accidental nor addressed, and she looked up at him, and he was looking at her with an expression that she did not have to guess at, because it was plainly and entirely legible. Jonas, she said quietly under the music. I know, he said. He did not elaborate, and he did not have to, because she knew too. After the dancing, they walked away from the square toward the edge of town where the road met the dark, and they stood in the cool October night with the music behind them and the stars above, and Jonas said, I need to say something. Say it, she said. He turned to face her. In the faint light from the distant lamps, his expression was serious and open, and she could see the work of gathering words in a man who had learned to economize them. I have been happier these past 2 months than I have been in 4 years, he said. I want you to know that, and I want you to know that it is because of you specifically, not the situation or the practicality of it. You. She looked at him for a long moment, and the October air was cool on her face, and the music from the square moved through it like water, and she thought about the 11 miles she had ridden in a dust storm in August to get an answer from a man who turned out to have much better answers than she had expected. I love you, she said. She said it simply and directly because she was that kind of person, and because she had decided during the second reel that there was no good reason to wait. Jonas Granger, who had spent 4 years building a careful, contained life, looked at her as if she had opened a door he had not been sure he would ever find the handle of again. Louise, he said, and then he stopped. Say what you are going to say, she said. I love you, he said. I have been trying to figure out how to tell you that without frightening you off for about 3 weeks. She almost laughed because it was such a Jonas Granger thing to say. You could not have frightened me off, she said. I rode 11 miles in a dust storm to yell at you. I am not easily frightened. He did almost laugh at that. The almost smile went all the way this time, and it was the most beautiful thing she had seen in a very long time. Then he took her face in both his hands with a gentleness that was its own kind of revelation, and kissed her in the cool dark at the edge of town, and the music played from the square behind them, and the stars were enormous over Texas, and Louise Cooper put her hands against his chest and kissed him back with the same directness she brought to everything, and neither of them moved for a long time. Reed arrived from Abilene the following week. He was a small, precise man with reading spectacles and a leather satchel full of documents, and he spent 2 days going through Louise's deed and the water rights paperwork and the original land survey with the thoroughness of a man who charged accordingly and was worth it. At the end of the 2 days, he sat at Louise's kitchen table with his findings spread before him and told her that her documentation was sound, that the water rights were properly registered, and that there was nothing in the original deed that Dunmore's lawyers could legitimately challenge. He also sent word to Dunmore through proper channels that any legal action against the Cooper water rights would be met with a full counter-challenge, and that the Cooper and Granger properties had engaged legal representation, prepared to pursue the matter to the district court in Abilene, and if necessary to Austin. Dunmore's response arrived 2 weeks later. He had made an offer on the old Weatherby spread south of town, a larger parcel that would give him some of what he wanted without requiring him to fight 2 entrenched landowners simultaneously, and he had quietly withdrawn from the discussion of the Cooper and Granger properties. It was not a permanent retreat. Louise understood that. Men like Dunmore did not give up entirely, but it was a retreat, a real and meaningful one, and when Harlan came to the house with the news, she sat at her kitchen table for a moment in complete silence, and then put her face in her hands and allowed herself a few shaking breaths of relief. She was still sitting like that when she heard a knock at the door and looked up to find Jonas standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands, because he had heard from Reed the same day she had, and he had come. "I know," she said, before he could speak. He crossed the kitchen and she stood up and he put his arms around her and she let him, because she was not too proud for that, not with him. She put her face against his shoulder and felt his arms around her, steady and solid as everything else about him. And she thought that this particular feeling of being held by a person who knew exactly who you were and had decided to be there anyway was possibly the best thing she had felt in her adult life. "It is not over with him," Jonas said quietly. "Not forever." "I know," she said, "but it is over for now, and for now is enough." He held her a moment longer. Then he stepped back and looked at her with that gray, direct gaze and said, "Louise, I want to ask you something." She straightened and looked at him. "Ask." He was quiet for a moment, gathering words with the particular care of a man who meant every one of them. "I want to marry you," he said. "If you will have me. I want to figure out what 2 neighboring ranches can become when they stop being 2 separate things. I want to wake up in the morning and have you be the person I am talking to." He paused. "I am not asking you to give up your land or your name or any of the things that are yours. I am asking if you would be willing to be mine, while still being entirely your own." She looked at him standing in her kitchen in his hat and his worn boots and his honest face, and she thought about her father saying the most important thing about a person is what they do when the doing is difficult. She thought about 11 miles in a dust storm. She thought about a lamp burning on a table between 2 chairs and the night unreeling like a spool of good thread, rich and long. "Yes," she said. "Jonas, yes." He crossed the distance between them in 2 steps and kissed her with considerably more feeling than he had shown at the edge of town, and she kissed him back with everything she had. They were married in November, on a Saturday that came in cold and clear, the kind of day the Texas autumn could produce when it felt generous, with a sky so blue it looked painted. The wedding was held in the yard of the Cooper Ranch because Louise had been born in that house, and she wanted to be married in sight of it. Half of Redemption Creek attended, which was to say about 60 people, and Harlan Briggs, who had been asked to give her away and who had spent the morning looking stoic and red-eyed in turns, walked her across the frost-silvered grass to where Jonas stood in his good coat with an expression of such open and particular happiness that several people in the gathered crowd who had known him for years said afterward that they had not been sure he was capable of it, and were glad to be proven wrong. The minister, a cheerful man from town named Reverend Ashby, who was efficient with his ceremonies, performed the service with economy and warmth. Louise had written her own vows, which Jonas had not known about and which made him go very still when she began to speak them, because they were honest and specific and not what anyone expected, and they were entirely her. She told him that she had come to his property to demand an answer and that he had given her one, and that the answer had changed the shape of her life in ways she had not anticipated and was profoundly grateful for. There was laughter from the crowd at that, warm and genuine, and Jonas's expression as she spoke was the most unguarded she had ever seen it, which for a man who valued his guard was saying a great deal. He had not written his vows ahead of time. He told her this quietly when it was his turn, without apology. Then he said, clearly enough for all to hear, that he had been a quiet man for a long time, and that she had reminded him what words were for, and that he intended to spend the rest of his life putting them to better use. Reverend Ashby pronounced them married in a voice that carried to the back row, and there was a sound from the crowd that was less formal applause, and more the kind of genuine collective exhale of satisfaction that a community makes when something that should happen finally does. The reception in the yard lasted until dark. There was food from a dozen different households, because the women of Redemption Creek took potluck seriously, and there was music, and there was dancing, and Jonas danced 3 times, which was 3 more times than anyone had seen him dance in years, and Louise danced in her good dress with her hair down in the afternoon light and looked like exactly what she was, which was a woman who was happy and knew it. They decided, in the practical and thoughtful way that characterized all their decisions, to maintain both properties. The Cooper Ranch would continue under its name, with Harlan as foreman and Louise in charge of its operations. The Granger Ranch would continue as it had. But the water arrangement became permanent and properly documented. The fences were reviewed, and in one case redesigned to improve the shared grazing access. And Jonas and Louise rotated between the 2 houses based on what needed attention, though the Granger house, being larger, became the primary home. They moved Louise's father's books to the shelf in the Granger front room, next to Jonas's own collection, and they agreed on no principle of organization whatsoever, which meant the resulting shelf was a pleasingly democratic chaos that neither of them particularly minded. Louise brought the kitchen garden. Specifically, she dug up her starts and her saved seed packets and her herb cuttings and transported them to the Granger property, where she established a new garden on the south side of the house, twice the size of the old one, in ground that she had Jonas break up with the plow because the soil was harder than what she was used to. She planted it in late November, not for this year but for next, the way her mother had taught her. The winter of 1878 to 1879 was harder than the previous one, cold coming early and staying late, the creek icing over in January in a way that it rarely did. They dealt with it together, the practical daily work of keeping 2 cattle operations alive through a difficult winter, the long cold evenings in the Granger house with the fire going, and the lamp on the table and the books, and the talking that never stopped being as rich and varied and interesting as it had been that first night. There were things that were hard and things that were harder. Jonas had silences that went deep sometimes, not cold but distant, the way a man gets when something old is moving through him, and Louise learned to read the difference between the silence that needed company and the silence that needed space, and she gave him what was needed without asking him to explain it first. He learned, in turn, to ask her when she was carrying something alone that she should not be carrying alone, and to wait for the real answer rather than the first one she gave, which was usually fine. In the spring of 1879, they heard from Jonas's brother Thomas in Montana. The letter had been routed through their father's old address and had taken some months to find them. Thomas was alive and apparently had been for the whole time, had been working a mining claim near Helena and had made modest gains and was thinking of coming back south. Jonas wrote back immediately, and the letters went back and forth through the spring. Louise had not met Thomas and was curious about him, in the way she was curious about all the pieces of Jonas's life that had existed before she knew him, because she was putting together the whole picture of him, and each new piece mattered. Thomas arrived in June. He was younger than Jonas by 4 years, which made him 29, and he was a different kind of man than his brother. Louder, more quickly expressive, with Jonas's gray eyes but a ready laugh that Jonas had not come equipped with. He came on horseback with everything he owned in 2 saddlebags and stood in the yard of the Granger ranch and looked at his brother and then looked at Louise and said, "Jonas, she is too good for you," which was the first thing he said, and which made Louise immediately like him. Thomas stayed through the summer, working the ranch and getting to know Louise, and gradually coming back to the Texas that he had not been sure he wanted to return to. He was good with the cattle and good with the horses, and he and Harlan Briggs at the Cooper Ranch got along extremely well, and by the end of the summer he had quietly indicated that he might like to stay, and Jonas had quietly indicated that he would be welcome, and Louise had said plainly that she thought it was a fine idea and they should stop being quiet about it. In July of 1879, Louise told Jonas that she was pregnant. She told him in the kitchen in the morning, matter-of-factly, because she was that kind of person, watching his face. His face did things she had not seen it do before. He went very still in the particular way he went still when something was significant, and then he came around the table and stood in front of her and took her face in both his hands exactly as he had at the edge of town in October, and he did not say anything for a long moment. "Well," she said. "I am trying to find the right word," he said. "You do not need a word," she said. He kissed her forehead. Then he held her in the kitchen for a long time while the morning light came through the east window and the coffee went cold on the stove. Their son was born in February of 1880, which made him a winter baby, which both of them had been, and which seemed appropriate. They named him Samuel, after Louise's father, and Jonas's middle name, which he had never mentioned before and which turned out to be James, was also considered, so the boy was Samuel James Granger, which Harlan Briggs said was a perfectly good name, and Thomas said sounded like a man who would give good handshakes. Samuel was a solid and opinionated baby from his first week, loud when he needed something and bright-eyed in between, and he had Jonas's gray eyes and Louise's dark hair and the stubbornness of both of them in full measure, which meant they were in for an interesting time, and they knew it and didn't mind. The years that followed were full. That was the truest word for them. Full in the way that good years are, not without difficulty, because difficulty is the ground everything else grows in, but full of work and purpose, and the kind of love that is not a feeling you have once and protect, but a thing you keep building, every day, out of the actual materials of your shared life. Dunmore came back in 1881, as Louise had predicted he would, with new lawyers and a new argument about a survey marker on the southern boundary of the Cooper property. This time she and Jonas went to Abilene themselves to meet with Reed, took Samuel with them on the 2-day journey because he was old enough by then to find it an adventure and too young to leave, and spent a week sorting through the documentation with Reed's careful help. The survey marker argument turned out to be based on a document that Dunmore's lawyers had presented out of context, and Reed's counterpresentation of the full original survey record dismantled the argument effectively enough that the judge in the case did not take long to find for Louise. Dunmore's lawyer shook Reed's hand in the hallway outside the courtroom with the particular rueful professionalism of a man who knows when he has met someone better. Dunmore left them alone after that. His interest shifted further west, toward land along a different creek system, and while Louise never trusted him entirely, she no longer woke at 3 in the morning with the particular worry of his shadow over the land. Thomas Granger, to everyone's mild surprise and his brother's quiet satisfaction, fell in love with a woman named Margaret who worked at the dry goods store in Redemption Creek, and who was as forthright and quick-minded as Thomas was warm and easily delighted. They made a complementary pair, and they were married in 1882 in the same yard of the Cooper Ranch, where Jonas and Louise had been married, because it had become the yard for such occasions, and Thomas said so at the reception in a speech that was funny and sincere, and went on about 4 minutes longer than it needed to. The water rights along the creek remained secure. Jonas had the agreement formally documented and registered in the county records in the spring of 1882, removing any future ambiguity. The shared fence line between the properties was surveyed and properly recorded. The practical architecture of their shared life was made solid and durable and legal, the way Jonas approached all things that mattered. Louise expanded the kitchen garden into a half-acre plot by 1883 and had more herbs and vegetables than two households could use, which meant the surplus went to the town, which was a quietly generous thing that the town noticed without her drawing attention to it. Samuel, at 4, was a child who asked more questions than anyone around him could answer, which Jonas said was his mother's influence and Louise said was his father's curse of taking everything seriously, and both of them were right. He followed Jonas around the ranch with a focused attention that was nearly professional, watching how things were done and asking why until Jonas developed a patient and specific vocabulary for explaining cattle management to a 4-year-old, which was not a skill he had expected to acquire, but was one he found he did not mind having. In 1884, a daughter was born. They named her Clara June. Clara for Jonas's first wife, which Louise had suggested herself, because she was not afraid of the past, and because she thought it was right to honor a person who had mattered, and June for the month of summer that was both of their favorite. Clara June was smaller than her brother had been at birth and considerably more cheerful about it, arriving in the world with a composed expression that made the midwife laugh. She had her mother's coloring and her father's gray eyes, and a temperament that split the difference between both of her parents in the most disarming possible way. Direct like Louise, patient like Jonas, and entirely her own self from the very beginning. Samuel regarded his new sister with the suspicious assessment of a child who has been the center of attention and is aware that this is changing. He announced after 2 weeks of observation that she was acceptable and began showing her things, beginning with the horses, which she could not yet appreciate, and then with the dogs, which she could, and then with his books, which she could only look at but which he read to her in the serious, instructional manner of a 6-year-old who takes his responsibilities seriously. Jonas watched his children with an expression that Louise caught often in the evenings, the look of a man who has been surprised by his own happiness and has decided to stop being surprised by it and simply be grateful for it instead. She told him once, on an ordinary evening, that she thought about August 1878 sometimes. About riding those 11 miles in the dust storm with the anger like a fire in her chest, and the borrowed horse, and the certainty that she was going to make Jonas Granger look her in the eye and answer for himself. He was sitting in the armchair in the front room with Clara June asleep on his chest and Samuel's drawing spread across the table in front of him, and the lamp making that same gold circle it had always made, and he looked at her across the room with the look she loved best, the one that was entirely direct and entirely warm at the same time. "Do you regret it?" he said. "The ride?" "No," she said, "not for a single minute." "The answer I gave you," he said. "Was it enough?" She thought about that night, the porch and the supper and the kitchen and the lamp and the talking that had unspooled through the dark until the morning came. She thought about the coffee at midnight and the fire in the hearth and the question she had been asked that she had not been expecting about whether she was hungry, which had been the door that everything else had come through. "It was more than enough," she said. "It was everything." He shifted Clara June carefully on his chest and held out his free hand across the room in that quiet, particular way he had of saying without words what he meant with his whole self. And Louise crossed the room and took it and sat beside him, and the lamp burned between the evening and the dark, and the house was full of the sounds of their life, the sleeping breath of the baby, the scratch of a boy's pencil on paper in the other room, the wind off the Texas plain, the distant lowing of cattle in the south pasture. The Granger land and the Cooper land were not two separate things anymore. They were what they had always been in their best possibility. One whole place, worked by people who understood what it meant to build something that would last, who understood that the hardest things were worth doing and the best things were worth staying for. Samuel would eventually grow into a man who ran both operations with the same methodical integrity as his father and the same fierce intelligence as his mother. And he would make decisions that his parents would be proud of. And he would have children of his own who would grow up on that same land with its registered water rights, and its solid fences, and its kitchen garden, and its shelves of books organized on no principle whatsoever. Clara June would grow up to be a woman who asked the kind of questions that made people think harder, who learned everything there was to learn about cattle and land and water, and then went on to learn more, and who had her mother's quality of not being frightened off by difficult things, and who would also eventually have a story of her own, though that story is hers to tell. Thomas and Margaret Granger had 3 children in short order, and Thomas said at each arrival that he did not know how he had managed to stay away from Texas for so long, and Margaret said with great affection that the answer was probably that he was not very clever, and he agreed with such cheerfulness that it was impossible to argue with. Harlan Briggs retired from the Cooper Ranch in 1886 with a gift from Louise that he protested, and then accepted, and he spent his remaining years in a small house at the edge of town that Jonas had helped him buy, and he came to Sunday dinners at the Granger house regularly for the rest of his life, and sat at the big oak table with Louise's children in his lap, and an expression of comprehensive satisfaction. The Redemption Creek of 1887 was a different town from the one Louise had ridden through in a dust storm 9 years earlier. It had a bank and a proper school, and a doctor who had come from St. Louis and stayed, and a newspaper that printed twice a week, and a church that had been rebuilt larger than the old one to accommodate the growth. Wallace Dunmore's name was still occasionally spoken in connection with a land dispute somewhere further west, but he had not troubled Redemption Creek again, and the subject was mostly historical. Louise sat on the porch of the Granger house on an October evening in 1887 and looked at the hills going gold in the last light. She was 33 years old, the age Jonas had been the day she rode through his gate in the dust storm, and she was thinking about that with the particular pleasure of a small private parallel that meant something to her. The hills were the same hills. The light was the same light. The world had changed in approximately every way that mattered. Jonas came out of the house and sat beside her and handed her a cup of coffee the way he always had, and she took it the way she always had, and they sat in the porch in the evening quiet. The children were inside. She could hear Samuel arguing his case about something to his father's ranch hand with the confident energy of a boy who has been taught to make his arguments properly. Clara June was reading from the sound of it because she was the kind of child who read until the light ran out. "What are you thinking about?" Jonas asked. "August of 1878, she said. He looked at her. "What about it?" "That I was so angry," she said, "genuinely furious, riding 11 miles in the worst of the summer heat with enough anger to power a locomotive, and now I cannot quite summon even the memory of it without feeling grateful for it." "You had every right to be angry," he said. "I did," she agreed. "And you had the sense to let me be angry and then answer me honestly, which is the thing I love you for above all the other things, and there are many other things." He looked at her in the October evening light, and she looked at him, and they had been together 9 years, and there was a weight and richness to that time between them like the grain of the good oak table, and he said, "I should thank you." "For what?" "For coming," he said. "For not waiting for me to do the right thing in my own slow time, for riding 11 miles and knocking the door down." "I did not knock the door down," she said. "I came around the side of the house." "You knocked the door down," he said, and this time the smile went all the way, full and clear and unhurried, the smile she had been watching happen for 9 years and still found, every single time, to be the best thing she had seen that day. She put her hand over his where it rested on the arm of the chair. He turned his hand and held hers. The evening moved over the hills in shades of copper and rose, and the lamp inside the house threw its gold light through the window, and the sounds of their children moved through the walls, and the Texas plain stretched away in every direction under the enormous sky. They stayed on the porch until the stars came out, because that was what they did, and they talked, because that was what they did, and the conversation lasted as it always had, as long as there was something worth saying and they were both still there to say it. Which was how it had started on a night in August 9 years ago, when a woman had ridden 11 miles to demand an answer, and a man had given her one, and then asked if she was hungry, and the conversation had lasted until morning, and had not in any meaningful sense stopped since.